Good afternoon, everyone, to today's event, Translation and Invisibility in the Media. It's great to see such a big turnout, one of the biggest ones for us for one of these events. Very exciting. My name is Chiara, and I'm actually here with my students at the University of Bologna's Department of Interpretation and Translation. We're very excited to have everyone here today and look forward to the talks by our distinguished guest speakers, Susan Bassnett, Federico Federici, and Michael Cronin. But before that, I'm going to take just a minute of your time to remind you that this is our first webinar in the lecture series Media and Humor Studies, or as it's called in Italian, Laboratorio Permanente of Media and Humor Studies at this department, the Department of Interpretation and Translation of the University of Bologna. And it's a lecture series that Delia, Chiaro, and I started a few years ago now. I don't remember exactly when, maybe she does, but it was a few years ago. And with the aim of sharing research by prominent scholars in the fields of not just translation studies, which is one of the main subjects, of course, for our department, but media, technology, and humor studies as well. Specifically trying to create interdisciplinary connections and to try and stimulate discussion across different fields. And I have to say that most of all, we consider these lectures as a precious tool to learn new things ourselves, to be honest. So we come, so to speak, from a very humble place of wanting to spread knowledge in fields or subfields that we're not necessarily experts in. And this year, we'll have 3 events for this lecture series. Of course, this format is a bit different, and I'm sure that Delia will be explaining this in a few minutes, different for obvious reasons. But in addition to today's event, I just want to remind you the next 2 webinars. The next one is going to be next week on November 17th, Tuesday, from 11 to 1, and the title is New Research in Media Paratexts. We're going to have, our guests will be 2 media scholars and 1 translation scholar. So we'll have Catherine Johnson, Catherine Batchelor, and Paul Grange. And our last webinar for this year is on December 7th, a Monday, I believe, at 3 p.m. It's called Communication, New Devices, New Normal, ? Our guests are Rodney Jones, Philip Sargent, and Tony Beale. And of course, this one is going to be not about translation, but about language and communication and the role of new devices and new technology in general. So I'll leave it to Delia. Just happy you could join us. And the number of participants keeps going up, so that's great. And thank you once again for being here, and I hope you enjoy the webinar. Over to you, Delia, to introduce today's theme and speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara. Thank you for that excellent introduction, and thank you everybody for coming. Welcome. There's hundreds of you out there, lots of you out there. Last time I looked, there were more than 200. Thank you so much, and hope you will come to all of them. They are exciting, and we really do have a bunch of excellent speakers. These webinars are the new normal. I try and get that phrase in all the time. I quite like it, the new normal. The difference between keep their mics off, please. Thank you. Please keep your mics off unless you're a speaker or an organizer. Thank you very much. Okay, so the only difference, the wonderful thing, the good side of COVID, the good side of new normal is that we can have speakers quite easily together in the same place at the same time. The only difference being the lack of biscuits and bad coffee and bad drinks. So I wanted to get that in at the beginning. And the three speakers today are each going to speak for 15 minutes on different angles on translation and invisibility. And at the end of all three talks, we shall take questions from the floor. So kindly put your questions in the chat, and Jennifer and I will try and somehow record these questions so that at the end you will all be able to ask questions. Our experience of these webinars, this is my third, not in this series, in a different series, but for the department. The best bit is, in fact, the discussion at the end. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion at the end. And of course, speakers, do feel free to note down special questions in case we're not fast enough, which is going to be quite interesting. Okay, so our first speaker, I'm really honored to have her here, I'm also honored to have her as a friend, is Susan Basnett, who at present is Professor of Comparative Literature and Translation Studies at the University of Glasgow, and also is, of course, Emerita in Comparative Literature from the University of Warwick. Somehow I feel she needs no introduction because of her incredibly rich career, her countless publications, but I do want to say this. This little book that I picked up in a bookshop in Birmingham, and there's the date, 1986, as a postgraduate. I think this little book that I'm sure all of us have read at some point, it may be little, but it really did introduce the UK, Europe, Western Europe to translation studies, which had been going strong. What's the name of the book? Translation studies. It introduced translation studies which had been going strong in the East, for example, in Russia, for example, and in other places. What Susan did was, in this short book, really bring things together. And even today, it's a brilliant book. I use it in my lessons. I quote from it in my lessons. I have over my career. And I'm really looking forward to this talk in which Susan is going to talk about visibility, considering visibility. And I'll give her the floor. Thank you, Susan. Susan, your microphone's off.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. Somehow we managed to mute one another. Okay. Right. Let me start again. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to Delia and Chiara and Jennifer for the organizing. I think it's very important that we keep this kind of communication during the pandemic. And I think it's perhaps a positive side that we can have so many people all coming together, albeit virtually. Now, this summer, I read 144 translations. Now, you may ask, why did I do that? They were novels, collections of short stories, poetry, memoirs. There was a collection of letters. There was some travel writing, children's books. And I read this because once again this year, for the fourth time, I'm judging the Women Writers in Translation Prize. And although we determined the final 6 and the winner last Friday, I'm not at liberty to tell you who it is. But the great thing about judging a translation prize, or indeed judging any literary prize, is that you come into contact with an enormous range of writing, with texts that you might not choose yourself to read. In this case, some of the authors were very well known, some were just starting out, and the same can be said for the translators. Some translators of these books highly experienced, others novices. Some translating into their native English, some translating out of a well, they're translating into English when it's not their native language. Some provide translators' notes, some don't. Some of the publishing houses are world leading, some are very small, and some, I confess, I'd never even. One of the interesting I can see is the increasing number of very small publishers who are actually venturing out into translation. Now, we met at the beginning of October. We formulated a list of 16, which we were then going to cut to the final 6. Now, obviously, in judging a translation, we're looking at the translations themselves and what the translators have done, but we're also looking at how the translators are presented. And I made a few notes here. We had, in our long listed titles, only one book that gave the translators' names on the front cover. Most published by actually a very small Scottish press, Charco Press. At the other end of the spectrum, we had one of the very significant novels by the Danish writer Tove Ditlevsen, the third of her Copenhagen trilogy, Dependency, which was published by Penguin, which only gave the name of the translator inside and gave no information on the translator at all. Most of the titles give you the name of the translator inside, but then provide, maybe on a flyleaf, a paragraph saying who the writer is and who the writer is. As we look at this, that the prominence or not given to translators can tell us a great deal about prevailing attitudes to translation in different cultural contexts. Anybody with an interest in theatre translation will know the particularly, I think, unfortunate English practice of having a translation appear as though it has been done by a well-known playwright, usually working off a draft translation by someone else. And there's just been a new book out published by Bloomsbury by Robert Stock, entitled Celebrity Translation in British Theatre. And that notion of celebrity translation, I think, is quite an interesting one. Now, one of the collections of poetry that we had shortlisted was Isabella, the first complete edition of a Renaissance Italian poet from Basilicata, Isabella Morra. There have been 2 plays about her life, a short film. I won't go into details here because I don't have time, except that the story of Isabella is not unlike Webster's Duchess of Malfi, with a noble woman who is murdered by her brothers. But what was interesting is that the translator, who provides a detailed preface, talked about this being an honor killing. What is actually going on in this translation, which also contains original poetry by the translator, Caroline Maldonado, is an attempt, in a sense, not just to translate the poems written by this woman, but also to translate her life to bring her into the 21st century. The notion of the honor killing, for example, this kind of language. Now, the fuzzy boundaries between translator and author have been endlessly debated. On the internet, all kinds of translation is taking place, and this is not a huge area. I've started taking an interest in the translation, the massive global phenomenon of the translation of Chinese martial arts fiction. I've got a PhD student at Glasgow working on this. And there is, of course, an extraordinary site which I would advise people to take a look at called wuxia-world.com. And I thought I'd read you a couple of comments that I found on the site about the task of translation. Here is one. Greetings, everyone. I am Wise Dragon, a writer in Korea. I am surprised that Life once again is being translated into English in the first place. I'm very curious as to what kind of nuance the writing of the English translations has in the perspective of an English reader. It must be better than the original work, since it has been through an exceptional translator's hands, right? I believe so. And another fascinating one is a farewell to Wuxia translation by someone who tells you, doesn't give a name, but says, you know, I am handing over to other people, and thanks those who have been involved in the translation. I read again, starting off, the editor. Second, the proofreader. Third, the postier. This for me was quite a new term, the person who posts it. And lastly, the one who drew the illustrations that you can find in the chapters of this novel. He has truly beaten my expectations and delivered some amazing art pieces. Now, what I found fascinating about this is that this is obviously a collaborative translation process. It's a collaborative translation process of let's say a form, a genre, which is basically an internet genre. And it strikes me as fascinating that here we have what is effectively a translation team, and this is one of the few occasions where the translation team is recognized, and thanks. It's a very long way away, of course, from our traditional notions of literary translation, because apart from anything else, the so-called originals, if we can even use that terminology, are unstable in that they're episodic, and the translations pretty well are being composed at the same time. And the idea of what constitutes author and translator are subsumed in the dominant role played by the text itself, which is evolving through readers' responses. The translator, therefore, the interlingual translator, is no more visible, more or less visible, than anybody else. Now, one of the things that I find, I was going to talk a little bit about Venuti and the way in which his ideas about foreignization and domestication have evolved, particularly in his latest book, Contra Instrumentalism, which I would recommend if people haven't looked at that yet. But I don't have the time for that. So what I'm going to do instead is just point out that one of the great services that Venuti has done to translation studies has been to highlight the diversity of translation strategies and to acknowledge the changes in aesthetic norms of translation across time and cultures. There's another little book that I have just come across, came out earlier this year, very interesting collection by one author, one translator, Kate Briggs, and her book is This Little Art, and she shares some of her thoughts about translation. Here's what she has to say. Books don't come with designated translators. They don't have built-in protocols, accepted codes of behavior that should be followed or ignored. Our manners of translating have to be each time improvised and invented in response to the book in hand. It's like meeting someone late at night at a party. And I rather like that, the idea that there is no, what she's basically saying is there's no right or wrong way to translate anything, which of course is the point that Venuti makes when he urges us, I read, moralistic terms like faithful and unfaithful to describe translation. Start defining translation as the establishment of a variable equivalence to a source text. And that seems to me to be a very helpful way of thinking. Because another point that Kate Briggs makes is that she describes herself as highly privileged. She's a literary translator. She can choose what to translate. She's not dependent in the way that the jobbing translator is. The jobbing translator has to translate very fast, has to translate work that she probably isn't interested in, maybe doesn't even understand fully, the fate of the translator, the jobbing translator who has to earn a living, is that debates about visibility or non-visibility are really pretty pointless, because what matters is getting the job done quickly so as to be paid and then to move on to the next one. When I had I'll just be a few more minutes, I think I'm keeping to time. When I had my research project on news translation a few years back, what was very apparent, apart from the total lack of any form of training for news translators, was that news stories were not translated, and I use inverted commas here when I say this as such, but went through, or go through, I should say, since this practice pertains today, a series of textual transformations that include translation, summary, paraphrase, addition, subtraction, etc., all of which are underpinned by domestication. However and wherever, I wrote this in a few years back, however and wherever any text, which may be oral, originates, this is for news translation, the objective is to represent that text to a specific audience on their terms. Now, in the 15 years since that essay appeared, global communication has expanded unimaginably. We've seen a lot more thinking about the ethics of translation. We've had Michael Cronin's important work on eco-translation. We've had Sherry Simon on the multilingual cities. We've had Federico Italiano's work on what he calls the dark side of translation. And we've had, as I mentioned, Venuti's attack on what he sees as instrumentalism. We've also had Siri Nergard and Stefano Arduini, and later Edwin Gensler, talking about what they call post-translation studies. And increasingly, the interesting notion which Madhu Kaza, in her book Kitchen Table Translation, posits, which is that a very large number of translators, or indeed maybe not translators, but human beings, I quote, experience translation all the time in our bodies, names, homes, movements, and daily lives, even if we're not translating from one text to another. Now, I see the focus of research in translation studies as having shifted in different moments in time. The role of the translator, the visibility of the translator, has been highlighted for the last few years. This is why we've had these debates about visibility. But what I think we need to focus on now, given the impossibility of establishing the desirability or not of the visibility of an actual translator, is the bigger question of the visibility of translation. This is what Gensler and Arduini and Nergard are talking about, along with others, when they use the term post-translation studies. It's what David Johnston and I have suggested in our recent special issue of The Translator, which we call The Outward Turn. Those of us working in translation studies may proclaim the importance of translation, but what is really needed now is to raise the profile and the visibility of translation as a very basic practice, as a very basic element in all our lives. So my message is, we're never going to arrive at a consensus about the visibility of the translator, but it is extremely important that we join forces, whether in translation studies or in other disciplines, to remind everyone of the importance of the visibility of translation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Normally you would get an applause here. I don't know whether that's possible on Teams. I don't know what would happen to Chiara's Jambra. Her microphones in that room would probably go berserk. Thank you so much. And I'm sure there are going to be lots and lots of questions later on. So I'll go. Jennifer's clapping, yeah, or as yeah. And we'll move on to the next speaker, Federico Federici from UCL London, University of London. And very recently, Federico has become Professor of Intercultural Crisis and Communication. I'm presuming, Federico, you're the only Professor of Intercultural Crisis in the world. Am I correct? Let me just
probably probably at this stage.
Okay, so Federico too has, we go back a long time too, has published extensively on everything from varieties to translated news, and at the moment I see he's very interested in managing vulnerability and humanitarian issues, which I think you will all agree, extremely timely. And his talk, so again, make your metaphor into a wall. Migrants, crisis, and the media. Over to you, Federico.
Thank you very much. Whilst I try to share my screen with you, hoping that it works on the first go. I want to thank Delia, Chiara and Jennifer for organizing the event, and Delia and Chiara for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I can see that I'm having some issues sharing the screen with you. I'll try again. And yeah, I can see now I am sharing my screen. So it's very nice for me to follow Susan Basnett's opening because of two reasons. One is of personal nature. I was at the final conference organized by Professor Bassnett with Professor Schaffner on news translation, and that was the beginning of my interest in the area of the role that translation plays in the media, or the role that it should play but doesn't play yet. And the second part is exactly this link, the link between the visibility of translation, of translators, of interpreters in the media. And I'm taking a particular angle. And I would like to share with you points that pertain to three areas. I want to move to the idea that figurative language, referring to translation as a language barrier, has had a crucial and crucially negative role to play in the UK when it came to reorganizing language policies in relation to immigration and integration. And I would like to show to you how a small-scale pilot that I ran very recently suggests that the impact of this misrepresentation of translating and interpreting in the news has had on the provision of translation and interpreting services at crucial points. And that impact is on translators and interpreters, but also on people who have suffered from the consequences of not being informed of specific risks. So, as I shared with you in my rather provocative 150 words of abstract, there are many metaphors that have appeared in the UK news about, in particular, migrants, and in recent years also connecting translation and interpreting services for migrants with the notion of a cost, of an exponential cost that cannot be supported by local budgets. So I've just chosen three. I mean, unfortunately, we could pick plenty of these expressions. One was used by the Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron, in 2015 that described migrants arriving from Calais into Britain as a swarm of people. Between 2013 and 2019, we've seen a plethora of news stories, especially from the Express, the Daily Mail, but many newspapers in the UK have used this, focusing on translation as a cost. And just last summer, the Secretary of the Home Office described a migrant invasion arriving on the UK. Now, language matters. We all agree, possibly in this kind of events, we all agree that language matters. So this talk is about the ways in which the language that's been used in the media has actually not only represented the politicians' views about migration, but has influenced over the long-term policies made around provision of language services. And whilst we often use language service, in the language service provision, we often use language barrier as what translators and interpreters overcome, that linguistic and cultural mediation that allows communication to happen. In an almost antagonistic way in the media, especially in the UK, the political rhetoric embraced over time by the news media outlet has transformed the idea of the language barrier into a wall. Rather the opposite, the antagonist of the Berlin Wall that I've used in this illustration, that represented what mediation of political, diplomatic, but also cultural nature could achieve for the future generation in the 1990s. Now we use the metaphor of the wall, the language barrier, as the wall that cannot be overcome, almost in a direct antinomy. And so I set out to conduct a very small sample study initially, including 10 years of news on on UK newspapers, ranging from The Guardian, the Daily Mail, the Financial Times, but also some BBC media outlets. And of course, I focus both on their press and their online version. And I had only 6 weeks to run this corpus, and I wanted to see whether there was a connection between the use of language and barrier as a metaphor in relation to discussion on migrants. And the initial raw data suggested that there's been a lot of usage, at least 120 approximately per year. Articles I've used language barrier in a way or another. Then I wanted to refine this data, and I started analyzing articles, and in particular I selected 146 articles that include direct references to the language barrier expression, and this is in relation to migration and immigration matters. And implicitly, but often also explicitly, in relation to translation service provision. So what we see, something that for those of us who live or know the affairs of the United Kingdom, we see the emergence of a pattern that is not surprising. We had 3 particular peaks in which the language barrier in both right-wing and left-wing media, in both tabloids and broadsheets, was particularly significant. The year 2013, the year 2015, and the year 2016 that corresponds with the referendum. Plus, of course, 2018 and 2019 had several uses of euphemistic expression referring to the language barrier. Why is this expression then become something that I would describe as problematic? I think the problem is not, of course, with the figurative language in itself, but is what it's become to represent in terms of the political vision of migration towards the UK and the provision of services. We find that editorials such as this one by Sarah Vine from 2015 that stated that perpetuating the language barrier by hiring so many translators is not only costly, it's also harming the very people it aims to assist. Meaning that if we provide translation and interpreting to recently arrived migrants, we are prejudicing their ability to integrate in the UK. Now, many colleagues working in Bologna in projects around language brokering will know how this is an incredibly complex area in which a lot of the translation and interpreting happens in various forms. But what is particularly significant, and I want to emphasize here, is that this argument has been accepted, perpetuated in the media, but has no corroboration in facts or evidence. The cost of translation and interpreting have been the same over the last 30 years, proportionally growing in relation to migration, but they've not been extortionate. The problem is that once this language has been embedded in the media and the political discourse that goes with it has been accepted, it's been rather easy for the UK government to transform the language barrier, a figure of speech, into a language policy. We need to do something about this language barrier, and that language barrier has been transformed into a wall. in a wall that goes against the very principle that it's supposed to support. The idea that translation and interpreting is a support to integration in society has been inverted, taken and put upside down. So here I'm not talking about integration in social and cultural terms. I'm not talking about sociology. I'm not talking about cultural studies. Unfortunately, I'm talking about a very mundane notion of integration that is the UK government, that is stated in a policy that dates back to 2012, which means integration means creating the conditions for everyone to play a full part in national local life. So integrating as part of a meaningful life within the UK. So our country is stronger by far when each of us, whenever our background, has a chance to contribute. So having the possibility to contribute means having that chance. Soon after this policy appeared, we started seeing a revolution in the ways in which the UK government supported provision of translation and interpreting to everybody in the population, not just recent migrants, but any multilingual communities already established in the UK. And the Secretary for State for the Department of Communities and Local Government that oversees language policies, integration, and at the same time, important to remember late, is also the department that takes control, is in charge of emergency plans and any crisis at local and national level, came out with the idea that translation of leaflets and documents was leading to an unintentional adverse impact on the integration by reducing the incentive for some migrant communities to learn English. So we can see that this is the precursor of Sarah Vine's later argument. What does it mean? It means that in a few months, the idea that translation and interpreting would become, on one side, incredibly visible, was also associated with the idea that this visibility depends on the fact that translation has a huge cost. And that cost is a cost that, rather than reducing distances and allowing people to integrate, encourages segregations. So you can see this document of 50 ways to save and examples of sensible savings in local government picked up translation as a form of institutional activity that undermines community cohesion by encouraging segregation. So not only you don't receive local budgets allocations for translation services, but if you read the second part of the quote, similarly, the government should not give community grants to organizations which promote segregation or division in a society, meaning local authorities are not given a budget to provide translation and interpreting services, and charities who receive budgets and funding from governments will not receive those if they intend to use that budget for translation and interpreting services. I mean, the impact here has been incredibly significant, and after the referendum on Brexit, we've seen this kind of policies being enshrined in what was initially a green paper in 2018 and what is the current Integrated Communities Action Plan, in which the notion is all about integration through the language, through learning the English language. Now, nobody would necessarily disagree with that view, but what this policy seems to suggest is that if I arrive today in the UK, tomorrow I have learned the English language. If I arrive with zero competence or with a Cambridge certificates in English proficiency, it doesn't matter to them. There's no time to learn English, so there's no need for language service provision because everything has to go through learning English. And this way of politicizing the use of translation and interpreting services as the barrier has also taken very personalized narratives. So we've seen the Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, who personalized his own experience as a language broker as evidence that lack of skills in English over a 10-year period means lack of integration. Now, we would agree that over a 10-year period, if you don't speak a word of English, integrating in the UK is difficult. But also there's a difference between not doing it for 10 years and expecting a new migrant to know English from day 2. So translation and interpreting exist in that time, in the time that it takes to become integrated gradually. But the changes in language policies mean that these very concepts have become confusing, contorted, convoluted in the most possible way. So one of the most recent strategies suggests that low levels of proficiencies also creates costs for providers of local services, such as local authorities and health providers, which have to pay for translation and information and may impact on others in the family, including children who have to act as translators for relations or friends who cannot speak English. So on one side, the government is saying we need to diminish the budget on translation and interpreting service provision, so that people get integrated, but by doing so, we're creating a reliance on the language brokers, the non-professional service. And at the same time, we are stretching the time needed for consultation in a medical setting. We're stretching operations in other contexts, and especially the healthcare context. Is there any risk attached with this particular view of translation as a visible cost for society? Well, the problem is that the risks for the national population in the UK are actually assessed quite significantly by the department that oversees language policies and oversees the policy on translation and language service provision for local authorities. And they have to comply with the Civil Contingency Act when it comes to providing information about any type of emergency, be it a terrorist attack, an emergency at personal level, a family level, or a pandemic. And communicating risk is part of the expectations of how this particular department in the UK government protect the local communities and the society at large. So I want to give you two examples before I draw my 3 points to close. And one example is of a recent tragedy that happened in the United Kingdom in 2017. You might have heard of the Grenfell Tower fire that happened in June 2017, caused the death of several people, 72 people, and the evacuation of a building in which you had families that spoke English together with 18 different other languages. Now, the emergency plan that is put in place by the same department that put in place the integration plans and the language policy plans suggests that when there is a major accident, such as the fire of the Grenfell Tower, within 4 hours, everybody has to be moved to an evacuation center, and sign language interpreting, translation and interpreting should be provided to those who don't speak English, because according to UK law, those who don't speak English are vulnerable groups, and vulnerable groups must be protected. Now, we've seen on The Guardian, but also in other newspapers, that it took two charities, Inquest and Translators Without Borders, 48 hours to provide translation and interpreting services to people who spoke 18 other languages than English. But the government, after 10 days and after 31 days from the tragedy, had still not provided a single line of translation or interpreting. So if on one side you could say that the language service provision policy put in place by the department was incredibly effective. There was no translator, no interpreter available from the institutions and the local authorities. But then on the other side of the story, when governments learn from what they've done wrong in a crisis, we see that the second question asked to the disaster manager who looked after the Grenfell Tower evacuation was whether he knew and investigated if there were people in the block whose grasp of English potentially obstructed the evacuation advice in place in the night of the fire. Again, obstruction, language barriers, walls of communication. So as a department, I diminished the language service provision, but I do expect firefighters to recognize the languages spoken by people who don't speak English. I expect them on the night of the fire to put in place a response that allows them to speak and communicate in 19 different languages, but I don't give them a budget or an expectation to know which languages are there. Now, is this something that I'm making up that is part of my own agenda as a researcher to focus on the visibility of translators, or is something that is more connected with risk communication, a risk to health and public health that has been demonstrated over time? Well, I would argue that is well known, and an organization that none of us have ever heard about, the World Health Organization, nobody knows anything about them in 2020, suggested in 2017 that accurate information provided early, often, and in languages and channels that people understand, trust, and use enables individuals to make choices and take actions to protect themselves, their families, and communities from threatening health hazards. Now, in many crises, but also in ordinary family crises, health is our first concern. We've all had to learn that in the most difficult way. So, knowing I need to draw my points to a conclusion, I want to finish by launching the idea that language has been made into a vulnerability in the UK. We could look at what the government has done on COVID-19, but it doesn't change much the picture if you look at the ways in which the British government has communicated in English, let alone in other languages, measures and mitigating measures against the pandemic. But there are 2 points that are worth mentioning. One is the fact that language is a social determinant of health, meaning that is one of those conditions of social, physical, or economical nature that would affect the ways in which we look after ourselves in ordinary conditions, but also it would affect the ways in which we have to access health provision in the long term. If we as societies don't provide a language support for our multilingual communities, then we risk creating additional health hazards for everybody. And I want to jump to my conclusions here that are linked with a recent report that came out. That shouldn't surprise us. We've not provided translation service, we've not provided interpreting service, and then when in July the Labour Party commissioned a review of the impact of COVID-19 on British, Asian and ethnic minorities to Baroness Doreen Lawrence, they were expecting to find that cultural and linguistic differences would have had an impact on how communities of linguistically and culturally diverse origins had been affected by COVID-19. And of course, they were substantially more affected. And it's not surprising that one of the recommendations of the Lawrence report is that the government should remove linguistic, cultural and digital barriers to accessing public health. Now, they spent 10 years doing so, and they've done it very successfully. Language and translation have become visible for all the wrong reasons. They are a cost. They are something that doesn't empower people, but limits our budgets. So if there is anything that I would like you to remember of my talk, are these 3 points. The power of language was never a euphemism, and the figurative language that has been used in the UK media undermined the role and the visibility of translation and interpreting service provision by making it visible. And in this way, it's supporting dubious policies of integration in the UK. It has made language into a vulnerability. And with this, I thank you.
Again, thank you so much. I'm sure everybody would clap normally. Thank you for such a timely talk. As you were talking, I was thinking of translation and the pandemic, and I'm sure you're going to get lots of questions. Nobody's putting questions in the chat. I presume you're going to put your hands up at the end and speak, seeing as the chat isn't being used. Thank you so much, Federico. And last, and certainly not least, we have Michael Cronin from Trinity College Dublin, where he is Chair of French, with a number after it, 17 something, Michael.
76.
1766, I wasn't sure what that meant. Maybe you will tell us.
Yeah, it was the year it's the oldest chair of French in the world, and it's basically was set up by the president, the provost of Trinity at the time, to assist travellers to Europe on the Grand Tour, so that they would speak French and German and Spanish and Italian. So he created these chairs in 1776.
Okay. And some Irish Gaelic as well, I presume. Professor of French, but I know him, and many of us know him for his work on translation, which has always been, I think, what I personally like to say about Michael. It's always outside the box. He's kind of a step ahead very often. I'm thinking of his books on ecology, translation in the digital age, and of course it's an oldie but a goodie. But when translation goes to the movies, where he deals with Borat, and the Marx Brothers, and he puts humour in the forefront. So I've got to love you for that, Michael. And this afternoon, he's going to speak about translation in the public square. Over to you.
Okay, many thanks to Delia, Chiara, and Jennifer for making this event possible. One thing that strikes me when you're introducing the webinars is that connection between media and humour. And I have to say that one of the things that I find works least well in digital settings is humour. It is almost impossible to get across or to communicate. And any attempts at using humour, I find I just get these sort of baffled Zoom expressions of disbelief and incredulity from people. So if this presentation is slightly humorless, you'll have to forgive me. I find that humour is the one thing that tends not to travel across the digital divide. What I want to do, if you like, in the time that I have allotted to me, is to basically look at this notion of media invisibility and translation, and to look at it specifically in the case of the digital media. And as part of, I suppose, a kind of general preoccupation that I have, which is considering translation and the activity of translation from the point of view of the environmental crisis. In other words, when we look at what is one of the central features of the kind of ecological depredation that has done so much damage to our planet and imperils our existence as species, one of the things that you find at the heart of it are various forms of extractivism. It's extracting resources, it's labour extraction of various kinds, and that very often the people who are at the forefront, if you like, of these extractivist industries, what Naomi Klein calls the sacrifice zones, are people who speak languages other than major languages. And the question of translation, language difference, and so on, that Federico and Susan have both alluded to, becomes quite paramount. But what I want to do this afternoon is to try and consider that notion of the sacrifice zone, that notion of labour and data extractivism, within the context of a number of developments, if you like, in contemporary political economy. What kind of prompted, if you like, my thoughts about this was reading an article a number of months ago in the London Review of Books by the great American critic Frederick Jameson. And he was writing about one of Joseph Conrad's novels, not a terribly well known one, The Shadow Line. And one of the things that you find in the Shadow Line, part of the kind of the drama in that particular novella, is the tension between people who've grown up in the great age of the sail, people who are, if you like, in the world of Lord Jim. It's a world of wind, it's a world of water, it's a world of the kind of craftsmanship of the sailor as he negotiates, if you like, the tempests of various kinds. And then what happens, of course, when steam is brought in, is that it kind of removes the romance from transport. It removes the romance from kind of maritime transport. And what happens, in effect, is that power then tends to get centred in the figure of the the captain, who becomes the kind of the locus of information, the person who's in possession of the kind of the technical knowledge that will allow the boat, if you like, to get from point A to B. And what happens in Jemson's terms is that the labourers, the sailors, go below the decks. So one of the things, of course, that steam transport does is it ushers in the era of fossil fuel transport. And fossil fuel transport, of course, is going to be one of the contributory factors to climate change. But when the labourers, if you like, go below the decks, they disappear from sight, they become invisible, but it's only because of those labourers who are working in the boiler room, the workers who are working in the engine room, that the motion or mobility can actually take place. So in other words, in order for that transport to happen, you must get a kind of a human technical coupling. But it's a human technical coupling that disappears from sight. So what I'm going to argue is that this is precisely what's happening in the contemporary moment in translation. That there's a kind of invisibility that's been built into the kind of the techno infrastructure of translation in the contemporary moment, which is something that invisibilizes, makes invisible the laborers in the translation field. And it's something that, if you like, mirrors or echoes that kind of techno-human coupling that we find described in Joseph Conrad's Shadow Line. But before I do this, I want to sort of sketch out very, very briefly major changes in the political economy over the last century and a half. The first, if you like, great transformation from the 1700s onwards is basically the kind of the shift from rural to urban areas, with the birth of the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of the production of goods in the imperial workshops of the world. The second transformation is what we sometimes call the services transformation, which basically comes from the 1970s onwards, where we see increasingly the kind of the economic emphasis shifting from an emphasis on production to services. And we get this kind of exponential growth in services, which is driving economic growth and employment in various parts of the world. The third economic transformation, which we are currently living through, which is not always described in as an explicit manner as it should be, is what Richard Baldwin, a business theorist, called the global transformation. By the meet. So in other words, we get kind of sort of two waves in automation. The first wave of automation is what happens from the 1970s onwards with the invention of the microchip. And then from 2010 onwards, and this is the kind of second wave of automation, it's the introduction of deep learning software and strategies into the construction of sort of the techno infrastructure. So whereas, if you like, initially in the first wave, we had the kind of notion of computing in a kind of a somewhat kind of simpler form of the algorithmic structure, kind of set of instructions that the machine followed. What we find in the second wave, and of course this is crucial, is that the machines learn from their own mistakes. We begin to develop forms of software that introduce these forms of deep learning. So what that means is that tasks like voice recognition, speech synthesis, language translation, identifying diseases from x-rays and so on, all of these things become possible in terms of what is happening in this second wave of automation. What is crucial, and I think this is something that really sort of echoes what Susan said at the outset, in terms of the outcome in translation studies is the way in which this globotics revolution is puts translation right at the heart of the single biggest economic change in our times. And that is basically a convergence of what is called AI and ORI. AI, you all know, this is artificial intelligence, but ORI, remote intelligence, is basically telemigration. How, if you like, automatic or artificial intelligence is used through machine translation to allow people parts of the planet to work in any other part of the planet. If you like, traditionally, what has been construed, and this is the term that Federico Federici mentions, this notion of kind of language as being a barrier to particular kinds of the performance, particular kinds of tasks. In other words, that one of the reasons that countries like India or Pakistan have featured so significantly in the kind of the Anglosphere is because they have workforces with high degrees of competence in English that allows them then to work as kind of teleworkers for industries in Britain, the United States, and other parts of the Anglophone world. Why this is not possible for other parts of the world up until now has been the fact that people don't have those degrees of competence in English. But what happens, for example, if you bring your machine translation to levels where, if you like, most significant tasks can be performed in a reasonably competent way? You apply that to what are called hollow presencing technologies, which are currently being developed, where unlike the kind of technology that we're using now, for better or for worse, you would be able to get the impression of me in a fully embodied 3D presence in your study or in your library or in the room that you're watching this from. This is probably a more terrifying thought than a consoling one, but this is what the technologists are working on. So basically what you're getting there is with this kind of convergence of AI and ORI is something that will radically change the nature of global employment. Because if you look, for example, at the fact that many professions in the developed world, that the wage differentials are something of an order of 1 to 10. In other words, that salaries are on average 10 times greater in the developed world than in the developing world with regard to salaries for professionals, then you can see the attraction for companies of this kind of technology. But of course, in order for this technology in order for this to happen, you've got to build translation right into the heart of this development. It's only, if you like, if you have this, that this sort of ORI is possible in any way. And one of the things that Baldwin says to kind of forestall, I think, a lot of comments that you might have, such as, yes, but the last time I tried Google Translate, it's lousy, this is very poor, and so on. He makes the point, and you'll hear this again and again and again, machine translation is not as good as expert humans, but it is a whole lot cheaper and a lot more convenient. This is very much the notion of the good enough translation, the gist translation, which is increasingly to the fore. And if you look at the fact that we have devices, apps like Say Hi, Waygo, iTranslate Voice, Skype Translator, Cortana, Amazon Translate. These are just some of the examples of the kind of the banalization of these apps throughout the world of users. So we can say, on the one hand, this is good news. This is good news, just like globalization has been good news for hundreds of millions of people in different parts of the world who have been, whose living standards have risen as a result of the globalization of trade. It's the standard defense of globalization, that it provides economic opportunities that are unimaginable. This is why 60% of the world's middle class are now in Asia, and that percentage continues to grow. The other side of the picture, of course, is that this outsourcing of labour means that the conditions of employment change rather dramatically. One of the sites, for example, that's mentioned by Baldwin is a site called Upwork.com. It's one of the major kind of outsourcing platforms worldwide. And Baldwin's kind of describing this platform. And he says that, and I quote, "Firing a freelancer is simplicity itself. You click on a button labeled end contract, and that's it. It's as simple as leaving this Microsoft Teams meeting. You just click on a button, and that's the end of the person's income." So this is what's sometimes called the pay-per-view model, where you're hired to do a particular job, and then once the contract is over, that's it. And another term that's used, of course, is gig economy, and unfortunately it's something that's becoming increasingly widespread in the academic world, as in so many other areas of life. So one consequence then is the potential for the dissemination of employment globally, particular types of employment. The second is the dramatic increase in social vulnerability of very, very large groups of the global workforce. The third consequence, and we've seen this in what's happened with the former President Trump. I never thought that I would get the pleasure of using that particular, but I can now, I think, safely say it. But Trump, the Brexit movement in Britain, the kind of the rhetoric that Federico Federici has just referred to, is the rise of a particular kind of populism, where millions and millions of people whose lives were destroyed by the first wave of automation, who found themselves in economic and employment wastelands, they translated a sense of economic dispossession into a very vocal kind of politics. So one may dispute whether in fact this is a very good or productive use of that outrage, but that to some extent doesn't matter. The fact is that the real political consequences. So all three of those consequences that I'm describing as potential outcomes of this kind of globotics revolution, which is at the heart of the current change in economic relationships, they all have translation at their core. In other words, as Susan Bassnett said at the outset, if we are to talk about the presence of translation in our lives, this is a way in which translation is going to be manifest in every single aspect of our lives. It will be a core aspect of this key transformation of the contemporary political economy. In order for that to happen, though, and this is where I want to return to my kind of labourers below the decks, we have to think about how this is going to happen. One of the things in 2013, a man called Ethan Zuckerman, Zuckerman was head of the, still is, I believe, the head of the MIT Civic Media Lab. And he said in his book Rewired, he said, look, if we look at the internet, if we look at the World Wide Web, if we look at how people use all of this digital media, so what strikes us about us? So we've been told that this is all about opening people up to new ideas, new places, new voices, new languages, new experiences. He said, what happens when we carry out ethnographic studies of media usage? We find that people look at content about their own place, in their own language, about their own culture, talking to their own circle of friends. In other words, the electronic frontier, becomes the digital backyard. So Zuckerman says, so what we need to do is we need lots more translators. We need these kind of polyglot mediators that will open the world up to the users of digital media. And that, of course, seems like a very, very good idea. It seems to be very much in the spirit of the kinds of things we might like to argue for. But how does he propose we do this? There's two ways. One is, he says, he takes the example of Yiyan. It's a Chinese site that was set up to translate information in the English-speaking world about China into Chinese, and has up to 200,000 volunteer translators. So it takes that as one model. The other is the Ray CAPTCHA. You know, when you go onto a site and they ask you to prove that you're not a robot, that you're a human being, and you type in, it's usually a series of letters. And what you're doing as you're doing that is you're transcribing books. This is developed by a man called Luis van Aan. Human computation. You harvest all of those disparate inputs and you put them together to allow you to transcribe books. So what he wants to do is to use all of the inputs from Duolingo, the app to learn a language. And we reach the very, very advanced stages. You'd feed people information from the internet. You then pull this together and you would create translations of web content. The problem is, of course, with the volunteer model, with the human computation model, is that nobody gets paid. So what you get then is the kind of demonetization of translation. So what I want to argue is, because I'm aware of the time running away from me here, is that if we are to have a visible role for translation in this new translation or new transformation in the global economy, which of course has been accelerated no end by the pandemic. The pandemic is having an extraordinary accelerator effect on this kind of globotics transformation as I speak. We need to be mindful of two things. One is the notion that there's two ways of viewing data. We can view data as capital, or we can view data as labor. Data as capital is basically the current model, that what tech giants do, what the GAFAs of this world do, is they take your data, which you provide free of charge, and they monetize it. What is basically the idea behind Google Translate? Google Translate 2016, it had its deep learning software, it had its computer processing power. What it didn't have was big data. And this is where the European Union kindly provides 800,000 documents in different languages. The European Research Council does the same. The United Nations does the same in 6 different languages. So we get Google plus data plus equals enhanced Google Translate. Not one single translator in the UN, European Research Council, European Union, ever received a cent for any of that translated work. So what this huge provision of a public good, what happened to it was its privatization to enhance the profits of one of the most profitable corporations on the planet. Right? So this is data as capital. Data as labor, which is the arguments being put forward by a number of activists in different parts of the world, is that people would get paid for the data that they produce. In other words, that translators would get paid, would get remunerated from the derivative uses of their translations. Now, one of the things, of course, that happens with things like neural machine translation is that very often the translations are broken down into micro and then micro units, which means that the question of traceability will become crucial in terms of the kind of tracing the path of translation activities. But what that means then is that if we think of the notion of a translation commons, If we think of the notion of data as labour, that means then that we move translators from being what are called the ghost workers in the new economy, the tens of thousands of people in poorly paid jobs in the developing world who are providing tasks or inputs for devices like Alexa, and will, if you like, be that their status will change, so that we can move translators from being ghost workers to visible workers. But in order to do that, we need, the first task is to make visible the invisibility, is to make visible if you like, the embedded work, translation work, the human translation work that's embedded in this kind of digital transformation, kind of globotics revolution that Baldwin and others are talking about, and is happening as we speak. But I realise that I have not only gone below deck, but I think run over time. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Ollie, thank you. That's a lot of food for thought, and thank you so much again. Applause. What I found incredible about the three talks was how similar they were. I mean, they were obviously different, but the theme of politics that has run through this is absolutely incredible. Now, I haven't seen many questions. I'm going to open for questions. I haven't seen any in the chat, but I have received at least one on my phone, and I can't see it anymore now. Mirella Gorni, if you would like to ask your question, open your mic, please. And
yeah,
where are you? Thank you.
Thank
and
you.
Your camera
Thank
as well,
you,
if you want.
I have a question for Susan. And first of all, Susan, it's so nice to see you almost in person. So I'm very, very happy to see you again. I have a question about, well, you mentioned the invisibility of translation, which is a parallel to translators' invisibility. Well, we can say that in recent decades, translators have become more and more visible. Some of the keywords, translators agency, translators networks, or for example, the concept of trust, which has been introduced as a model for the historical study of translation. I'm thinking about Rizzi, Pym and Lang, their recent publication. Well, I'm very interested in a historical perspective, and what I can see as an area which has not received enough attention is a historical study of collaborative practices in translation. When we think about collaborative practices, we tend to think about the internet. You mentioned the internet, Susan. So we tend to think about the present. But translators have never been working in isolation. I mean, there's nothing like some kind of, how can we call it, solitary agency in translation. So I would be interested in writing some kind of history of collaborative practices in translation. And I'd like to do that in a collaborative way. So if anyone is interested, please get back to me. But going back to Susan, I mean, I'm thinking about areas such as the history of print culture or the history of the book. Well, translation itself and also translation practices, I think that they should play a bigger role in these areas. I mean, collaborative practices in translation were popular, were public actually, since the very, how can we say, the very onset of the age of print. And I'd like to have your opinion on this topic, Susan.
Susan, can you put your mic on, please?
I've just realised. As I was saying before this meeting started, I'm used to working with Zoom, not with Teams, and the system is slightly different. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Loud
yes.
and clear.
All right, okay then. Well, Mirella, I said it's very nice to see you too after such a long time. I'm all for any project that looks at the history of translation practice. I think it's always been a valuable line through translation studies. Collaborative practice, yes. Self-translation, what Turi calls pseudo-translation. All of these are areas that would merit a lot more scrutiny. There's a lot more to be done. But I think the point I was trying to make, and I see it as in fact connected very much to what Michael and Federico have been saying, is that yes, in the last few years, there's been an awful lot more emphasis on making the translator visible. In looking at what translators do, translators have spoken out for themselves. But for me, the big issue is the visibility of what I'm calling translation. And I think we've heard from the other two speakers, Delia refers to the political message. I don't see how one can think about translation without thinking about the political context. Translation is a political act. It is not, as I've said many times, it is not an innocent act. It involves all kinds of dimensions of power, whether visible or invisible. So yes, I would say I think the idea of looking at collaborative practice historically is a very good idea, but I think also that for me at the moment a very pressing need is to make translation itself, and the fact that so much of all our lives involves translation. That's the message that I think has really not come across. And when David Johnston and I commissioned the various essays, including one by Michael, for the outward turn, one of the arguments we were trying to put forward was translation studies has developed in ways that were undreamt of when it first started out, but not an awful lot of people beyond the reaches of translation studies know much about translation studies, nor do many other disciplines, other parts of society think about translation. And this for me is a very pressing, very, very important need at the moment. That was the message I was trying to get across. I don't know if any of the other colleagues want to comment on this.
Yeah, if I could just come in and say hello to Mirella from Dublin. There is a book that came out in 2017 that was co-edited by Anthony Cordingley and Céline Frigo-Manning on collaborative translation from antiquity to the digital age. But that's a very, very good introduction to the kind of the issues around the area of collaborative translation.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yep.
Okay, there was a hand up from the United States. Dror, is that you?
Yes,
you have a
good
question?
morning.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, it's around 10 a.m. here, and my question is to Professor Cronin. Professor Cronin, you wrote in 2003, and I've been quoting this paragraph for ever since, that translators should also be visible in positions of public policy, media, social institutions, as cultural experts. Right? So to borrow your metaphor from today, you're talking about translators coming from below deck, going to the officer's deck and helping to steer the ship. So my question is, since 2003, have you seen this happening? Translators taking visible public policy positions, and could that be a partial solution to the issue of the automatization of translation?
Michael, your mic's off.
Yes.
There we are. Okay. I think it's because Zoom, it automatically switches on your microphone. This is
Exactly.
remember Microsoft Teams too. Yeah. I think, thanks for the question. I think where I've seen this happen is in the world of NGOs. A number of years ago, about 10 years ago, I was asked to work with Amnesty. They wanted to move away from their kind of the policy that they had originally was they had a number of kind of foundational languages, which tended to be, of course, major European languages, and they wanted to think about how would they develop a translation policy for an organization where some of the most serious human rights abuses were occurring in languages that were way outside the remit of these kind of vehicular European languages. So I found kind of working with that organization, it was interesting to see the kind of I suppose the learning process for Amnesty to begin to think about all those things they hadn't thought about, and precisely a lot of the issues that were flagged by Federico Federici there. Subsequently then Oxfam began to do work around this kind of question of linguistic self-reflexivity. Greenpeace did the same, Friends of the Earth. So there's been a lot of activity in the sort of the NGO area, where there's been a lot less has been, I think, at levels of state policy. And this is partly to do with the kind of political retrenchment that Federico in part described. I mean, one of the features of xenophobic populism, wherever it manifests itself, is the one language, one nation policy. It's very much kind of that long shadow of monolingualism from the 19th century onwards. That's very much at the heart of that kind of. So some of the advances that were made in terms of language policies, and community provision and so on, that there's been a kind of a rollback in the last number of years, and I think this is. And part of the blame, I think, must lie with progressive forces in our society who haven't placed the question of language plurality kind of center stage. In other words, that I think it would be quite a revelation for many people who formulate policy in different areas to listen to what we've just been describing. I work, for example, with a kind of a think tank that for a group of parliamentarians here who are to the left of the political spectrum. And what I find again and again is that just people not thinking about why language matters, why it saves lives, why it facilitates integration, why it improves educational performance. Why there's all kinds of pluses that come through from translation.
Michael, you switched yourself off. Your mic's off again.
Okay, can you hear me again? Is it okay? Well, I just the point I was going to make there was that
you've done it again. Yes, your mic's off, Michael.
It might be the space bar. If you hit the space bar, it might toggle it off and on. So if you're hitting the space bar, it could be that, possibly.
Okay. I keep my hands up in the air so that you.
A good idea.
Yeah, just very quickly. I think one of the reasons that this may not have happened to the degree I would have hoped is that there's still a kind of a lingering problem, I think, amongst translators themselves, maybe a lack of confidence in their competence to participate in public debate.
Okay, a question, thank you, Michael. A question has just come up for Federico. Can you see it, or do I need to read it out?
I can see it, thanks. So I'm working as an integration coach, translator, and writing my PhD in translation in Germany. How do you see the continuous small sizing and celerizing of translation into integration initiatives programs designed to integrate refugees? Yeah, I noticed that a lot of job offers prefer, but not require social care workers and psychologists to know 1 or 2 refugee languages. Now this is the crux of the matter, really. It partially answers also one aspect of the questions that Dro put forward before. I do know even from the participant list that people like Lucio Bagnuolo in Amnesty are very attuned to what translation means in these settings, what it means in refugee settings, what it means not in the case of Amnesty but in the case of other NGOs, what it means in terms of not only integrating but allowing people to access basic services from schooling, education. But there is another dimension there, is that even where international entities working in the humanitarian sector recognize the position and the significance of translation and interpreting, and they might be devising very strong policies for language access. What we noticed in the recent survey that we ran with crisis managers, disaster managers, communication officers in international organizations was that there's nobody who takes responsibility. So one thing is to have this policy notion that translation and interpreting matters, and the other one is yeah, but somebody else can do it. So we need a psychologist. Let's employ a psychologist who knows a second language and therefore can double up as a translation specialist, as an interpreter on the field. Now that's a huge risk, and not only there's the immediate risk for loss of information, but there's also the risk that again we go back to the simplicity of the idea that you budget for something, and translation is always the add-on, interpreting is always the add-on, and you can never provide a level of service that is required. That was something I found particularly interesting to find out, is that maybe the organization, maybe the people who deal on the ground have a very strong feeling of how much they're failing in terms of language access, but they do also have all of these constraints that are political in nature that do not allow them to change their policies or to implement the policies that they would like to implement. Now that was that is very problematic in obvious ways when we think about interpreting refugees, interpreting migrants, interpreting, but it is highly problematic also when we think about a person who happens to be in a place of the world, in an airport, and the pandemic erupts, and they don't speak that language, and they're stuck for 3 or 4 days with information only in partial English, in broken English, and they need information to go back home or information about anything else. Yes, we can do most of those things connected on the internet, but there is also a question of being able to trust that information. And that is what often the visibility of a professional translation service provision gives you, that you may be trusting somebody. So going back to Mohamed's question, is translation remains ancillary in terms of budgeting. There's no two way around about it. In those large organizations, it's still ancillaries. What I would like to do with the rest of my career is probably try to bash some heads around and make people in political settings understand that, yes, we can move from labor below the deck to steer the ship in better directions. Because what is my personal monkey at the moment is that those discussions about budgets are rarely based on a cost-benefit analysis. Meaning that if they're budgeting for translation interpreting, in very few situations, those organizations are thinking, what happens if we do not offer translation and interpreting? How much more do we spend if we don't do it? Now, it sounds such a banal question, and I do apologize to the audience for the banality of this question, but if we don't try to find an answer for that question, I think that in terms of policy change, we're going to struggle to make any leeway.
Yeah.
Can I just go very quickly on that? I think that question of cost is crucial. But one of the things that's never mentioned in the context of cost is the huge opportunity cost of major languages to the global economy. The thousands of millions of pounds that economies invest in the acquisition, for example, of English, is a huge burden, a huge cost that's borne by economies and societies in different parts of the world. So I always find that the debate around cost and language to be so kind of asymmetrical. It's the notion that it's okay for economies and countries to bear the huge cost of learning majoritarian languages. But when it comes to acquiring or learning the languages in our different societies, then that cost is deemed to be sort of excessive. And there's François Green, who is an economist who works in Geneva, has done some very interesting work on just how much these languages cost. So if we're going to talk about cost, well then we should be talking about comparative costs, not some kind of absolute notion of cost. And of course, I think one of the questions that all of this begs is, I work in a school of modern languages, when I look at the modern languages that are spoken on the tram and the bus, and I used to be able to get onto these things before lockdown, it's Lithuanian, it's Mandarin Chinese, it's Polish, and I think, are we teaching those languages, in our modern language departments? To what extent do, it seems to me the kind of notion of the modern language department is still very much rooted back in 1776, when my chair was set up, and I wonder to what extent, for people who work in language departments, whether we are in sync with the changed linguistic realities of our societies. That there's a job of work to be done, not just in persuading the administrators out there, the bureaucrats, the politicians, but also perhaps the educators. And we need to think differently about things like language instruction as a precondition for translation.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody. Just before, there's a question for Susan here, but just before, I'm just going to come in there and with the demonetization of translation, etc. How on earth do we go back? I mean, with the gig economy, translation is just one, or certainly perhaps the most important, but just one aspect which has been worsened by COVID, of course. How do we go back to monetizing translation? Anybody? How on earth do we go back to monetizing translation, to monetizing so many things that the gig economy and technology have demonetized? Obviously, what interests us is translation. Your mics are off. Susan, your mic's off. Or if you were talking.
I've unmuted again.
Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, I don't do this to myself. I don't know how it keeps happening, because I am deliberately almost sitting on my hands, since I normally wave them about. Anyway, when you say go back, I think I have a problem with the actual phrase. Go back to what? I mean, I think we're all agreed that the situation have changed. The radical change means that we have to kind of step forward into something different. So I think it's how to put it. I think the point I was making before about the need, and this will deal also with the question that I see has come up on the chat about the outward turn. The basis of the outward turn, I do apologize, I'm in my study and that's the external phone. I can't do anything about it, or I can. I stopped it. Right. The issue is that translation studies, as I see it, has spent a long time building itself into what some people call a discipline. I think it has tended to be unduly inward-looking. I think that one of the reasons and I'm not just saying this lightly, but I admire the work of the other two speakers here, is that translation studies actually needs to be more outward-looking, needs to be more engaged, and needs also to recognize that other disciplines, other fields, other academic fields, let alone before we start going out into the world of public policy, just has not taken on board the importance of translation. I think this is the message that really needs to be put across. The outward turn means turning out beyond the sort of work that we do and have done within translation studies and looking outwards and endeavoring really to raise consciousness in terms of the wider public with regard to the importance of translation as an essential, fundamental part of the lives that we all live. And I would argue that this has always been the case, but at this moment in time, with the movement of peoples, with the mass migration, with globalization, it's even more essential that we try, all of us, to get this message across.
Fede, your hand was up.
Yes, if you don't mind jumping in, because I think what both Susan and Michael have said connects to one important point, back to your question, Delia, which is languages do have a value that is attributed to them. And of course, the broader the economic power of that language, the more likely you are to spend a budget on it. But the paradox is that we see that in some organizations, to collect data from the ground, from languages that are not the European strong languages, French, German, and of course English, and Spanish, what you do have is that translation happens between those languages professionally, where you do have the creation of a survey that is organized by social scientists in English, then it's translated into Spanish, and then somebody who speaks Spanish delivers it in non-Spanish speaking areas of South America using oral interpreting of the gist text, and then recording partially translated answers in Spanish that need to go back to the donors of the organization in English. So if you see the problem of going back to showing that, I think for me, it's language as a power is an obvious part of the conversation for us. But I feel that sometimes when we speak to other colleagues who may not be maybe in political sciences or in areas in which also there is this acceptance that language has a power that is attributed, etc., the lack of understanding of the consequences of these multiple mediations, of this multiple data loss, is barely perceived. And just to finish with an anecdotal one, the very important London School of Hygiene last year commissioned a work of translation to be completed in 7 days from Spanish into English to translate essential data on a tropical disease that was affecting part of South America, to be translated in a week for £300. Now, what does that tell us about the value that researcher attributes to data? Because that's the bit that goes back to what Michael was saying. Data as a value, but that value has to be attributed to it.
Yeah. And Michael wants to step in, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just really in response to your question, Delia, picking up a little bit on what Federico and Susan Bassnett have been saying. I think one has to bear in mind that, currently both the European Union and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development are actively looking at ways of breaking up the mega corporations. They're looking, the European Union in particular, is basically doing what was done in the States in the 30s with Roosevelt and the antitrust legislation. These corporations are too big. They are a threat to democracy, and they need to be broken up. And as part of that, the dismantling of these corporations is the notion that people will get rewarded for the labour that they put in. In other words, that the kind of the expropriation of labour, which is happening at present, the data's capital model, increasingly there are forces, pushing through these major organisations. I'm talking about sort of fringe groups at meetings and major organisations who are pushing for this kind of data as labour model. So if that's the case, then this is where translators can move in as part of this kind of global ghost worker force to make their rights, their voice heard. I mean, the thing that always I think one's got to look at is look at slavery. Look at the industry in the second half of the 18th century. Millions and millions and millions of pounds riding on that industry. This, infamous practice which underpins so much of the wealth of cities, jobs, and so on, and that only a number of extreme, mainly religious extremists opposed this. But it grew, and it grew. When I was a child, my mother could not buy a car in her own name. She had to get her husband's name to be able to take out a loan. She had no access to reproductive rights of any kind, contraception, divorce, abortion, none of these rights, and now they're available. But if you were to ask my mother in 1967 whether she thought that any of these things were possible, she probably would have thought it was a very extreme or marginal position. So I think if we look at the history of the anti-slavery movement, if we look at the history of feminism, I think we have to take hope. It's too easy to lose hope. It's particularly easy to lose hope in the time of the pandemic. But I think we have to be to look at things that are afoot in our societies. And because I will say this, is I think the environmental, the climate emergency leaves us with no choice. We simply don't have a choice. We must act on these things.
Thank you. There's a question for somebody, a very long one, from Abdelrahman. Translators and interpreters have a vital role to allow people to work and communicate in international contexts at times of humanitarian disaster and situations of crisis. Interpreters are even more important, and they should be in. Hang on, I'm getting to the question. Can you explain more the important and specific role of translators and interpreters? What are the skills that they and mechanisms and skills they should develop? I think that's
well, yes, I believe that was for me. But one of the things that we've been trialing with a course entitled Crisis Translation that intends to put forward those skills. We trialed it at UCL, Sharon O'Brien and Pat Cadwell had done it at Dublin City University, and with Minako Hagen we've done it at the University of Auckland, is to an ability in trainee interpreters and translators to work with emergency managers and support them in understand what could be the need for language interpretation or language translation in general in those contexts. And in a way, it is a very strange exercise of allowing our students to verbalize their skills as translators and interpreters in a way that makes them relevant to others who do not consider translators and interpreters as a relevant part of society. So in a way, it could be, in simplistic terms, it could be we're making unionist translators, if you want. They're supporting the associations and the professional roles, but it goes beyond that. It goes more into understanding the fact that there are situations in which suboptimal conditions are the best conditions. So you have access to nothing no machine translation engine to support bilinguals, very poor linguistic competences in bilinguals. So not everything can be planned for in extreme emergencies and crises. There is a difference when we talk about humanitarian context, when you're not in the response mode, but you are developing resources, you're developing language support. And in those areas, the skills are different. The skills are work with policymakers, work with people who have a huge amount of demands on the limited budgets, and understand this value. And I totally support Michael's point that this is not something that we can postpone. I've been working in the last 3 years with a lot of disaster studies specialists, disasterologists, and no disaster is a natural disaster. We're always responsible. Cool. And natural hazards cause crises that we cannot predict in terms of language, context, cultural situations. For instance, the earthquakes in New Zealand affected the Japanese-speaking community of New Zealand. How can you predict that is your language need before it happens? So you cannot predict everything, but what you can support is institutions to understand that we need to point the spotlight in these areas, and we cannot wait any longer.
Thank you. There's one more question here. I think we still have time for a question for Michael, for Professor Michael. And the question is on, whether human translation is going to, I'm the synopsis of it, human translation is going to be replaced. Do you think it will disappear with automatic translations coming into their own?
No. I think one of the analogies that I often use for this is the area of food production. One of the things that sort of occurred after the Second World War and with the Green Revolution, as they called it, in the 50s and 60s, was this huge kind of industrialized production of food. And what people gradually began to realize is that this food was making the consumers sick and obese, and was making the producers sick, perhaps not so obese as the consumers, but that there was something about this industrialized production of food that had very, very harmful consequences. And I would argue that what we see with machine translation, certain aspects of it, is the industrialized production of language. The kind of that what I've been talking about is this earlier about that kind of move from 2010 onwards. Is really ramping up this kind of industrialized production of language. And I think that one of the consequences is that just as there was the kind of the slow food movement, which begins in Italy in 86, that we see in many ways a kind of a slow translation movement, which is the idea that we have to pay attention to language. That just think of the two things that we do with our mouth: we eat and we speak. So if we're careful about the kind of food that we put into our mouth, should we not be equally careful about the kind of language that we take in, the language that we use to communicate? And I think one of the things that we see from Bolsonaro's Brazil to Trump's America to the Kaczynski operations in Poland is what happens when you get a degraded language.
You've gone again.
You've gone again with your microphone, Michael.
And I didn't touch it. But I was saying that one of the things that happens, or I think we see in the contemporary politics, is the consequences of what happens when language is degraded in various ways. So I think that the kind of attention, the care, the time that translators devote to language is going to become more, not less important in the context of the industrialized production of language. So it seems to me that it's for us then to articulate that case as part of a kind of a broader ecological argument about paying attention to the world that we live in and the words we use to describe it.
Will you just allow me a joke? Let's hope we can become slow professors and slow universities, and together with the enormous slow movements in all walks of life. I'm going for slow academia. Okay, there's a question from Gaia Aragrande, and Gaia, I'm going to try and summarize it. The fact that she's using the example of Italy, but I think this is the same in many places. As Federico was saying, we don't have unions for translators, we don't have unions for interpreters, and therefore it's easy for somebody to get a job in translation, even without the right whatever they are qualifications, which might be a degree from a place like where Chiara and I work, or a degree of some sort, of qualification of some sort. Who is the question for? For all of you.
Well, one of the things, am I muted?
No, you're not. We can hear you.
Right. One of the things that we found on when I had my research project with Esperanza Bielsa on news translation was the total absence of any kind of training at all in the big international news agencies of translators. However, I'm sort of a bit hesitant about this because it's all part of, in a sense, it's part of the same need. If we raise the status of translation and language, then ultimately the rewards, let's say, and the recognition will come. So I think it's you know, translators have always been poorly paid. I think translation has not been, you know, it's been poorly paid and not particularly highly regarded. This is part, I suppose, of what all of us who are working in the field are trying to deal with. So yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to hear this, but one could cite lots of similar examples all over the place. I think it is part of the issue of making translation and making language more significant in society.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Well, there's an idea in indigenous thinking in very many parts of the world. It's it's called naming the names. The part of the way of achieving a resolution around any particular problem is to try and is to identify what the source is of. And I think as Susan quite correctly says, that if you demonstrate that something is of value and point out why it's of value, then all the rest kind of follows on from that. I think it's kind of a downstream thing.
Yeah, Grey Lives Matter will be the next. Yeah. There was another question, Mirella. Michael, can you give us any further reference for this notion of industrialized production of language? For you, Michael.
There's a book by Aaron Stibbe. That's Stibbe. His book Ecolinguistics has got some very, very good chapters on that kind of how language becomes industrialized in the production of it.
Okay, it's 5 o'clock. Chiara, where are you? Chiara, do you agree? Should we wrap up? Would you like to wrap up? Where are you?
Yes. Hi, sorry, I had switched off everything. Yes, definitely. Thank you so much to everyone. We can't thank you enough for all of this food for thought, as Delia said, excellent and stimulating talks, and for everybody's feedback in the chat. I just wanted to say that I posted a link to our next event in the chat, and I'll do the third one. I'll also post the third one maybe closer to the date, and always maybe keep an eye on mine and Delia's social media profiles for promotional messages about these talks. So thank you so much. Thank you again. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you also from me, especially the speakers, but everybody for the questions. Jennifer, Thank you, Jennifer. Without
yes,
you, we would have
absolutely.
probably collapsed after 2 seconds. Who else have we got? Thank you. Shall we thank the secretaries? Oh yes, and thank you for your forms. You sprinkle them with fairy dust. You go round and round in a circle, and hopefully everything will work out fine. Okay. Thank you and goodbye.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good to
Thank
see
you
you
all.
all.
Ciao, ciao. Au
Bye.
revoir.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Federico. We will write to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.